Okay, welcome and happy Sabbath. Let's start with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you that we can come together in this group. Thank you for the Sabbath, for this opportunity to study, to discuss, to share different views. I ask you for help to find answers on our questions. I ask you for your wisdom and Holy Spirit. Please guide us in the study and please let us see what you want to teach us. In Jesus' name we thank you. Amen. So my study is about Islam in connection to the Sunday law waymark. I believe that the institution of the USA commits a sin at the National Sunday law waymark. They fail their test and suffer shipwreck, and this is the close of probation and judgment for the institution. In connection to that, we should see the third woe as a scourge against the army of Rome for this apostasy. So now in the first part, we will look at the sin of the institution. And in the second part of my study, we will look at the scourge and look at the third woe. I want to make clear that I'm talking about the institution, not about the individuals. So the institution is shipwrecked at the National Sunday law waymark. This is their close of probation. So it's not their Sunday law, but it's their close of probation. That means their test begins before this waymark, which is Exeter 2021, is the beginning of the test, or it's the midnight cry for the institution. And this waymark, the Sunday law waymark, is the end of the test. It's close of probation. So we should not mix it up with the line of the 144,000, where we have here the national Sunday law. And the test is afterwards. The test is at the loud cry, going until close of probation. But here in the line below, we have the line of the institution where the test is already over. So when I'm talking about the Sunday law waymark, I'm talking about this waymark here on the line of the institution. I believe that the waymarks are whole years. Depending on the story, there are different dates within that year. So I think that the third woe should be seen in the year of shipwreck of the institution as a scourge for their apostasy, for their failure, for not passing the test. I think the problem that people have with seeing Islam at the Sunday law is that neither the Bible nor Ellen White give us any information about the third woe. We don't have any of our famous lines that show an event at the Sunday law. And I think it's because it is hidden truth. But we have it in Acts 27, and I believe we have to combine it with Acts 28. We see the east wind not only at 9/11, but we see it also at the Sunday law. And I believe it will empower the second and the third angel's message and confirm our method once again, as it did at 9/11. I already have shown at the camp meeting in France the ship of Acts 28, but many people have not seen this as to be correct. And I think the reason is because Elder Tess has already made an application, and she has put the line, the ship of Alexandria in Acts 28, she has put at the close of probation to the second advent. So she put the first ship of Alexandria of Acts 27 from here before, and then afterwards she puts the second ship of Alexandria from Acts 28 here as a consecutive line. But she also said, what I want to do is lay out a structure without attempting to make any serious application. So I think it does not contradict her when we do another application, a second application for Acts 28, sorry. I have used 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏 as a third ship. So I'm doing a third line. And it's also, of course, a line of the institution. In this story, we see the same symbols at the 2001 waymark as we see at the Sunday Law waymark. And I will repeat quickly my study. So 1798 is Alexandria. It's the beginning of the ship. The ship of 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗏 starts in Alexandria. So it's the beginning of the institution. Then the second waymark is 1989, which is the city or the island of Melita, where the ship stops. And Melita means honey, which is the little book opened. Therefore, I placed it at 1989 at the time of the end. Then Syracuse, the next waymark, I would place at 2001 because it means swamp. It's located at two rivers. No, this is not the reason why I placed it there. The reason why I placed it at 2001 is because Paul tarries, the tarrying time we have at this waymark. Then I will come to these symbols later. Then 2021, the city of Regium means breach. And I believe that this is a symbol for January 6th, when the democratic institution was damaged. In 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗏, this is the moment when the ship almost shipwrecked, but then they cast 4 anchors and were therefore able to delay the shipwreck. So on January 6, 2021, democracy was almost overturned. Trump and his followers did not accept that they had lost the election and wanted Vice President Mike Pence to not certify the election outcome. So they wanted him to go against the votes of the people, to silence the voice of the people. It was like a coup attempt. But at that moment, the institution was strong enough to survive, but it received first breaches. So therefore, I would mark 2021 Regium, which means breach, at this waymark here. 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗏 said that January 6 is part of the Exeter waymark of the line of the 144,000. And she said, we need to see January 6 as a prophetically significant event. It provides a window in America's future because of what has been done with its sins. So the whole year, starting from January 6, needs to be discussed. So I think this really belongs to Exeter. And it's a window, it's a prophecy for the next waymark, for the Sunday Law waymark. Now, 4 years later, on the day, on January 6, 2025, the person that almost destroyed democracy in 2021 was certified to be president again. Then on January 20, the first days when he was in office, he pardoned the rioters of January 6, and he began purging the FBI and other federal services from all who investigated against him because of January 6. So January 6, 2021 and 2025 is bookended. It's the history that got reversed. As 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗏 had said, it's a window into the future. It was Exeter. It's because of January 6, there was an impeachment, there were several lawsuits and a Supreme Court decision. And despite of all what he did, he was allowed to run as president again. He was nominated by his party. The party should have been the gatekeeper to keep extremists out, but they voted him in at the RNC in July. Then there was the election, then the Electoral College meeting, and finally the certification. So none of these democratic processes that should actually prevent an extremist to come to power worked. He came through all of these gatekeepers. So the certification would have been the final moment when objections could have been made, but when Kamala Harris certified him without any objection by the Congress, it was done. And on January 20, on day one, as he promised, he immediately began his work acting like a dictator, issuing a flood of undemocratic, unequal decrees and flooding the zone, basically. So I believe that on January 20, or I believe January, I would put 6 and 20 together, that in this month, the institution of the USA has committed their biggest sin. It's finally shipwrecking democracy. In 2024, it was prepared, but in 2025, it was implemented. And in my opinion, it's not the voters who commit the sin, but it's the institution, the parties, the democratic processes that did not function as gatekeepers anymore. It's not about the individuals at the 𝘂𝗏 here, but it's about the institution. The democratic institution received the mark of the beast because it's shipwreck and it's close of probation for the institution. So it's still a democracy on the paper, but the extremist, the demagogue, is in power now. So the executive, legislative, judicial are all in his hands officially since January 20. In my understanding, this is the institution speaking as a dragon, even though it still looks like a democracy, like a lamb. So another reason why I would place Rhegium at 2021 is because we have the south wind here. In X27, we have the south wind at 1989, which is the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union. And in X28, we have the south wind at 2021, which is the beginning of the fall of Russia. Now, we don't see the east wind in X28. We have here in verse 13 only the south wind, but not the east wind afterwards. But we know it's a rule of nature. It's a repeating pattern that Paul did understand. He knew that when there is the south wind, the east wind will follow directly after. So that means at the next waymark, there is the east wind. It's just a rule, a law. Luke 12:55 said, "And when ye see the south wind blow, ye say, there will be heat, and it cometh to pass." And the word heat means euros, a very dry, hot east wind. So it's just the rule. When you see the south wind, you know there will come the east wind. So even if you don't accept my application of X28, I think we can surely say we saw the south wind in 1989 and we saw the south wind in 2021, Soviet Union and now Russia. So when we have the east wind in the waymark after 1989, we should see the east wind in the waymark after 2021. Now, the final waymark of X28 is Puteoli. This is the city where the ship lands. It's the end of the ship, it's the end of the institution. Therefore, I would place it at the Sunday law waymark. Puteoli means sulfurous springs. This city is placed on sulfurous springs next to the volcano in Italy. Sulfur is found in the King James Version under the antique word brimstone, and it's basically a synonym. So the word brimstone is found in several places in the Bible and is connected to judgment. It points to the final judgment, to the close of probation. But in Revelation 9:17 and 18, brimstone is part of the symbols for Islam, for the second woe, for the Ottoman Empire. So for us, the second woe is a parable for the third woe, the spiritual Ottoman Empire. So at Puteoli, at the Sunday law waymark, we have brimstone or sulfur as a symbol for judgment and Islam. At 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗏, we see the east wind because we saw the south wind in the previous waymark. And we have the symbol of sulfur or brimstone. That means we have two witnesses pointing to Islam at this waymark. And it's a symbol for judgment, which means close of probation for the institution. The woes are the scourge for the army of Rome at this waymark at 9/11 and also at the Sunday Law, in my opinion. They don't kill the army of Rome, but they hurt it, as they did already at 9/11. Sulfur has also to do with the method of warfare, as Uriah Smith said. And as I said, we have we have same symbols or similar symbols at the waymark of Syracuse, which is 2001, and at the waymark of the Sunday Law, which is 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗏. So we have the city, which Syracuse is located on Sicily next to the volcano Etna and 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗏𝗃. Then we have the swamp and we have the two rivers. The city is located at the mouth of two rivers. Then at the Sunday Law waymark at 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗏𝗏, we have the sulfurous spring. We have the city, which is located on the volcano Vesuvius, and also 𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗏𝗃 at this waymark. Then in X27, we have the two seas that meet, now two rivers and two seas. And then we have the east wind in X27, and we have the east wind at this waymark here. So we have several symbols at both waymarks that are similar. As I said, I believe that a waymark is a whole year. So depending on the story, there are different events within that year. And we saw this in 1798, also in 1989. And I would suggest we have this also in 2001. So it's not only 9/11, but it's also a whole year that needs to be considered. To understand this year, I would like to recommend to rewatch the first 10 minutes of Michael Moore's documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. It begins with the election of 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush. He is showing how the Republicans did everything to make sure to win the election. They suppressed voters in a huge scale, and with the brother of Bush, who was governor of Florida, there was a lot of corruption. As the result was so close, they did a recount, which changed the results in favor of Al Gore. But at the end, the Supreme Court decided that the recounting of Florida should stop and that Florida was won by the Republicans. This was a highly controversial decision. And on January 6, 2001, the election result was to be certified. There were several Congress people, especially Black Congresswomen, who brought their objections, but no senator helped them to sign the objection, and therefore the objections were not valid and Congresspeople were silenced. At the end, Bush was certified as president by the Vice President Al Gore. So Al Gore certified his own defeat. There were two young lawyers who came to Florida and helped Bush in the Supreme Court case and basically to win the election. And these young lawyers were Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, and Brett Kavanaugh. And we know all of them are sitting in the Supreme Court today. So I think there is another connection between the election or certification of 2000, 2001, and today. So January 6, 2001 was a crucial day for the institution of the USA because they certified someone as president who did not rightfully win the election, as Michael Moore portrays it. Other people did extensive researches about this election and came to the same conclusion. For example, investigative journalist 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗏, who did a great documentary about the history of voter suppression. The 2000 election was definitely not fair and free. Many people protested at the inauguration day because they felt that their voices had not been heard. So it's all about voting. It's the most fundamental principle of a democracy, to let the people decide who they want as their representatives. Now, George W. Bush, in his first months in office, he did a bad job and did not have much support. The country was very much divided, and Bush had very low approval ratings. But then happened 9/11, and after 9/11, it changed completely. The book, How Democracies Die, explains very good what a demagogue needs in order to consolidate his power. He needs a national emergency as justification for anti-democratic measures. They write here that crises are hard to predict, but their political consequences are not. They facilitate the concentration and very often abuse of power. Wars and terrorist attacks produce a rally round the flag effect, in which public support for the government increases, often dramatically. In the aftermath of September 11, President Bush saw his approval ratings soar from 53%, which is very low, to 90%, the highest figure ever recorded by Gallup. So the last sentence here, the combination of a would-be authoritarian and a major crisis can therefore be deadly for democracy. So September 11 is really the turning point. Michael Moore shows first the controversial election and certification of George Bush, and then 9/11. It really looks like cause and effect as he portrays it. We could also say sin and scourge. At the certification of George Bush, the institution committed a big sin, and I really recommend to rewatch the first 10 minutes of this movie. Then 9/11 was the east wind hitting the ship of the institution. Why? Because the east wind is a scourge, and a scourge comes because of a sin. So there must have been a sin before 9/11. And I believe it is the sin that is exposed in Fahrenheit 9/11. It's the sin of damaging democracy in January 2001, bringing a president to power in an unfair election and without the clear majority of the voters. We saw how the USA began to transfer from being the glorious land to becoming the Sunday Law movement. It began in 1979 with the moral majority, the Heritage Foundation, with Reagan, and also with George W. Bush. In my understanding, democracy gets overturned when the voices of the people are silenced, and in other words, it's voter suppression. Then it's not we the people anymore, then it's not a glorious land anymore. The history of the voting rights should not be new to us. Justice Hugo Black said in 1964, "No right is more precious in a free country than that of having a voice in the election." Another justice said, "The right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is of the essence of a democratic society, and any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government." And what I believe is so important to note is that the Republicans clearly don't want everybody to vote. Paul Weyrich, the leader of the Heritage, or the founder of the Heritage Foundation, said, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people." He said, "As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down." So he really wants not everybody to be able to vote because he knows it is bad for the results of the Republicans. A former speechwriter of George Bush said, If conservatives become convinced that they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism. They will reject democracy. Peter Thiel said that we should not have women voting because they overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. Also, Donald Trump was very open about what he was doing. He said that if you make it easier to vote, a Republican would never be elected again. He said, quote, "They had levels of voting that if you would ever agree to it, you would never have a Republican elected in this country again." So in a dictatorship, it's a minority that is ruling over the majority. And the Republicans, they even don't want the votes. They don't want to be voted by the people because then they can be voted out again. Then they depend on the will of the people. So across the USA, Republican lawmakers have introduced hundreds of bills in many states to restrict voter access. The Republican Party has no interest in appealing to a majority of Americans. Instead, they are doubling down on anti-democratic tactics so they can get a minority of votes but have a majority of power. It's extremely shocking to read how especially votes of women are suppressed in the last years. So when we look back at the election of 2000, in my understanding of all of this, George Bush and the Republicans cheated themselves to power before and after the controversial election of 2000. This was their biggest sin. And at the certification, January 6, 2001, this sin was finally manifested. It begins all by suppressing the votes of the people. As I said, voting is having a voice, and everybody should have a voice and should not be silenced. So this means for me, pretending to be a lamb, pretending to be a democracy based on equality, on equal rights, but speaking as a dragon, which is speaking as a dictator and living patriarchy instead. You can read in Great Controversy what Ellen White says about the lamb-like horns and the dragon voice. The lamb-like horns and dragon voice of the symbol point to a striking contradiction between the professions and the practice of the nation thus represented. The speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. So the sin is controlling the consciences of the people. And I would interpret this as not letting them choose whom they want as their representatives, which is in other words, suppressing their votes and ruling over them against their will. As already explained, we had an election in 2000 that was not free and fair. We had the election of 2016 that was not free and fair. Hillary had won the popular vote, and she would have won if there wasn't Russian interference. Then we had the election of 2020 that was not free and fair. Biden won, but nevertheless, there was cheating by the Republicans. That's why Trump did not believe the results and wanted to find the votes. It's not a conspiracy that they had problems with the votes counting computers and software. And there was definitely voter suppression. But the cheating was on the side of the Republicans and not of the Democrats. But the Republicans just did not have enough success in order to win. So the Republicans issued hundreds of laws that made it more difficult for minorities to vote. And why should they do this if they would win fairly and freely anyway? So I know we are in the Sunday law, and I know the world is sexist and patriarchy is ruling. I know that a woman could have never won the election at the Sunday law, but it's not, in my opinion, because she doesn't get votes. It's because the whole system is corrupted. The Republicans will never let a woman into power And this is the test for the institution, not for the people, not for the voters. It's the institution that failed the test. Now, the election of 2024, it was exceptional because the results were so quickly published. It was such a clear win for Trump. He won clearly also the popular vote. The Democrats and the media all agreed that it was a fair and free election. It looked like the people clearly wanted Trump and Harris had no chance. It looked like democracy was strong. In the movement, many said, yes, that's what we expected. At the Sunday law, the majority will vote for a man, for Trump, and a woman can never win this election. But to be honest with you, I don't believe that this is true because the Republicans win by cheating. We have examples from history. We know the hundreds of voter suppression laws. We know gerrymandering. We know how the Republicans manipulate and cheat. They took all precautions to guarantee that this election will be won. There are many reports and documentaries about especially Blacks and other groups, such as female students, that vote normally for the Democrats, and they are being suppressed from voting, and it got worse in the last years. The definition of a fair and free election, according to Wikipedia, is that it's a fair count of eligible voters who cast a ballot. It's a lack of electoral fraud or voter suppression and acceptance of election results by all parties. So just with the voter suppression laws, the election was not fair by definition. Also, when we look at the character of Trump, he wins by cheating all his life. So why should he win the biggest thing in his life by being fair and honest? It just cannot be the case. The historian 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗿 said in 2020, you don't take away the drop boxes if you think that people want the policies that you are advocating. You don't suppress the vote if you think what you are doing is popular. You don't try and shut people up if you think that they are going to be speaking for you. You don't go out there and lie about all your policies if you think people actually want them. Now, voter suppression covers several strategies. It is the strict voter ID requirements, it's restrictions on mail-in voting, it's polling place consolidations and closures, it's limitations on early voting periods, it's voter roll purges, it's criminalization of election worker assistance, and it's barriers to voter registration. And this has a disproportionate impact on minority communities. So in my understanding, a democracy is fallen when a minority of rich and influential people is ruling over the majority. This is dictatorship, even if it still looks like a democracy. So again, I don't deny that the majority is sexist and also that far too many like Trumpism. We see patriarchy gets more and more popular all over the world. But in my understanding, the majority does not want to be suppressed by an authoritarian leadership because the majority is liberal and wants freedom. And I think also the polls confirm this. There are journalists and organizations that are fighting since many years for fair and free elections. And they are analyzing the elections for years. They have a lot of experience in this. Their mission is to make sure that the people can trust in fair elections, which is the foundation of a functioning democracy. These organizations, for example, Smart Elections is one of those, they have found serious concerns about the 2024 election. And after all that we learned about the Republicans and Trump, I have no doubt that what these organizations say is true. You can do your own researches because I won't be able to read all of their arguments. And I will post a few links here. So if you don't believe this all to be true, it would be good if you check those links out and do your own research. I think even if we were not in the movement, but just as citizens who care about democracy and about our right to vote, even then we should stand up for truth and not believe the lies of a demagogue, because he is a cheater. These organizations found clear evidence. They wrote letters to Harris still in November to call for a recount in several swing states because of serious concerns. They also said, for example, there were over 200 bomb threats that disrupted voting and may have impacted the chain of custody of ballots. So all of these, they are listing different reasons why there were problems. And all of these points should have been investigated. Here is, for example, a letter to Kamala Harris on November 15 by a security expert. And he also says, you should reverse your concession. Call for both a full investigation of criminal activity and demand hand recounts in all 7 swing states. In my professional view, there are multiple and extremely clear indications the presidential vote was willfully compromised. He's also saying the results of the attack are improbable and the extreme and well tailored to the sole benefit of your opponent. So she had all those information already in November after the election, when it was still time to call for an investigation and for a recount. There's another organization, Election Truth Alliance. They did extensive analysis of the election data and found serious concerns about manipulation. It's also worth to check. And they are also fighting in different lawsuits now and are bringing regularly updates on their progresses. 𝘃𝗶𝗴𝗲𝗲 is an investigative journalist who has expertise in election investigation since 25 years. And he did a really good documentary on the history of vote suppression and Jim Crow. It's very well researched and worth to watch. This is the link here. It's called 𝘂𝗽𝗴𝗲𝗏 Inc. And he said that according to his extensive researches about voter suppression, he is sure that Harris would have won the election just based on the numbers of votes that had been suppressed. He is listing here some key numbers, which is really interesting. He's saying, as in Bush versus Gore in 2000, and in too many other miscarriages of democracy, this election was determined by good old vote suppression, the polite term we use for shafting people of color out of their ballot. We used to call it Jim Crow. And he is doing calculations based on statistics and analyzing. And he is calculating that Harris really would have won clearly the election. He's saying the nasty little secret of American democracy is that we don't count all the votes, nor let every citizen vote. He's also writing that since the 2020 election, at least 30 states enacted 78 restrictive laws to blockade voting. Here on the bottom, if these vote suppression laws had no effect on election outcomes, then why did GOP legislators fight so hard to pass these laws? The answer is clear on the Brennan Center's map of states that passed restrictive laws. It's pretty much Trump's victory map. So this is the map here. All those blue-colored states passed those restrictive voting laws between 2021 and 2024. And basically all of those laws Trump got in the 2024 election. again, 𝘂𝗽𝗴𝗲𝗃, she said that since 2021, 34 states cut back on voting rights. And we look at 2024 and people say, well, you know, why didn't Black people show up for 2024? And they don't put that together with the fact that we have had these voter suppression laws. And these have been going into play in America, as I say, since 1986. But they really dramatically take off in 1998 when Florida throws about 100,000 people off the voting rolls right before the 2000 election. Well, how many votes did the 2000 election come down to? And people point to the butterfly ballot in Florida, which did in fact siphon off a lot of votes from Al Gore to a right-wing candidate. But 100,000 people were dropped off the rolls in 1998, right before the 2000 election. And that has been multiplying ever since then. And that's one of the things that the American people are going to have to grapple with, because we are getting rid of the idea of fair and free elections, because simply find they are unable to vote. Their votes get discounted, their votes get challenged for one thing or the other. So I think we should take that serious. It should not come as a surprise to us that the election was definitely not fair, even if the Democrats and the media told us so. Also, Donald Trump said, Elon Musk knows those computers better than anybody, all those computers, those vote counting computers. And we ended up winning Pennsylvania in a landslide. Thank you, Elon. So I believe the Democrats should definitely have called for an investigation before January 6th, before they certified the election results. Kamala Harris certified a demagogue into office. The Republican Party brought him up when they did not function as gatekeepers anymore, but Harris certified him at the final end. At the end, the Democrats did not fight anymore. They surrendered to their fate and to the fate of the citizens. They compromised. I think we can compare it to 1850. The South was pro-slavery, so therefore they were bad since the beginning. The North was against slavery, but compromised for the sake of the Union. With that, they committed a huge sin. So I think if the Democrats would not have accepted the election results now, there would have been violence and possibly civil war. So they had to accept it for the sake of the Union. They had to compromise. But with that, democracy finally shipwrecked, even though it still looks like a democracy. It's not comparable to a real dictatorship like North Korea, and it will remain a lamb, but it's also no functioning democracy anymore. It does not speak like a lamb anymore. The different gatekeepers for securing democracy did not prevent an extremist coming to power. We saw what the new president did on day one. It was acting like a dictator, issuing a flood of decrees and even beginning a persecution against equality. Therefore, I believe January 2025 is the starting point of the Sunday Law. It's the beginning of the Sunday Law period. The Democrats were not able to say that the election was rigged because they would have repeated his lie from 2020. They assured back then that the vote counting systems worked well, so they could not admit now that there was definitely security breaches and that this should be investigated. Trump made it so clever in spreading the narrative of a stolen election back then. He already made it so the Democrats could not use the same phrase 4 years later, when the election was indeed stolen by him. It was a very clever strategy and it worked perfectly. The rule number 1 in the narcissist playbook is blame victims for what you yourself are guilty of. So he cheated in 2020 already, but he still lost. That's why he refused to believe the result. Imagine if he had lost 2024 again. He was convicted of several crimes. Elon Musk said, we have to win or we go to jail. So they just could not leave that outcome to the voters. So what should we do now with this? We could say that we trust the mainstream media and not those independent journalists or organizations. We can say they are spreading a conspiracy of a rigged election and repeating the conspiracy that Trump spread 4 years earlier. But I would argue that we are living in an information warfare. We know that the media is not so independent anymore. We already saw that, for example, Jeff Bezos changed the Washington Post. And as I said, the Democrats will not admit that the election was not fair. There is no way back for them. Both parties failed completely. So we rely on those organizations who are doing a great and brave work to research and find the truth, to reveal what is really happening behind the curtains. And you can do your own researches and read those sources, check the numbers. And I think we should believe them instead of believing the lie of Trump. Also, Daniel 11:23 says that the king of the north works deceitfully. This is just his character. Now, I'm almost done now. Based on Acts 27 and 28, I was certain that Trump will not be elected by the majority of the people, but that he will be nevertheless certified as president. The majority would vote for Harris, but they will not let her into power. Instead, Trump will be certified. Now, January 6, 2001 was pointing to January 6, 2025. A president was certified that was not elected in a fair and free election. Now, in 2024, we had Trump as a clear winner already on November 5. But that's only because they made it so clever and prepared it in advance. They knew another insurrection and violence would not be successful because the Democrats were prepared for that. So the election result looked as if the majority wanted him, but this is a great deception in my opinion. By definition, it's a lie that the election was free and fair. So in summary, the sin of the institution at the Sunday law of both parties was committed on January 6, 2025. And I want to clarify that I'm talking about the line of institution here. For the institution, it's not the Sunday law, but it's close of probation. In this study, I wanted to show with the line of Acts 28 that we have the same characteristics at 2001 and at the Sunday law waymark. We see problematic election outcomes at both waymarks, and we see symbols of Islam at both waymarks. Now, 2021 is exeter for the Sunday law, and January 6 is a window to the future of America. It was almost shipwreck, but they dropped the 4 anchors and certified Biden and Harris into office. So they had 4 more years to fight for democracy. And also the Republicans had 4 years to prepare the takeover of the government. Now, voter suppression is the big fundamental sin of a democratic country, of the glorious land pretending to uphold democracy while speaking as a dragon. It's a direct attack against equality. It's not only against Black people, but also against women. There is, for example, a new voter suppression law in the pipeline that is called the SAFE Act. And this will affect especially married women who changed their last names. So I suggest that we see the manifestation of that sin in 2025 with the certification and inauguration of a dictator after an election that was not fair and free. I wanted to show that the King of the North works deceitfully and does not win fairly. the institution receives the mark of the beast at this first Sunday law waymark, not the individuals. The test for the individuals comes later. In my opinion, July 2024 was Exeter. If we look at the fractal, it was a prediction, a foreshadowing of what happened in January 2025. So in my next study, I want to look at the east wind as a scourge and bring this then together with the sin. So let's close in prayer. Dear God, I thank you that we could discuss about these things, that I could share my views. I ask you for help when we share our opinions, when we try to answer questions. I ask you for wisdom and help that we can see how this will all fit together and how the Sunday law waymark really looks like and what you want to show us about this important waymark. Please help us and guide us in the coming hours of the Sabbath day. In Jesus' name, thank you. Amen.